How's it going, people? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the Pointless Polo project. Today I'm going to be lowering the car basically. I've bought some Bilstein B4 dampers and I've bought some Eibach Pro Sport lowering springs and I'm going to be taking them to my dad's garage to get them put onto the car because it's quite a difficult job to do kind of the difference between obviously dampers and springs versus coilovers. So everyone was telling me to get coilovers and everyone was saying get the JOMs or get the FKs or anything like that, but there's so much debate around what's the best kind of set of coilovers to go for, and people were pretty much telling me that a lot of them are pretty bad quality. So I thought, why not go for two brands that we know are trusted, so Bilstein and Eibach in this case, and obviously use them to their maximum potential as opposed to just lowering the car for the sake of lowering it. I want the car to be good around the Nürburgring, so I'm interested in getting good quality, and I'm interested in the car looking a little bit better but not looking slammed or anything ridiculous. I'm not here to just drop the car by 70 or 80 millimeters and just see how it goes. So that's kind of where the mindset is behind these, and I'm going to show you the process of putting them on. I think a lot of it will be my dad putting them on, but I'll show you the process regardless because it's not ridiculously difficult. It just requires some tools that you probably wouldn't have at home. So just for your reference, I'm lowering the car by 30 millimeters, which is perfect because the Bilstein dampers can be dropped 40 millimeters, which is kind of why I'm doing it, or why I bought the dampers. I've heard a few horror stories around the standard OEM dampers getting ruined when you put lowering springs on them. So I thought, why not buy the Bilsteins where I know that they're going to work and they're not going to go wrong or anything. So that's why I bought those. To any of you asking why I'm not just putting lowering springs on the OEM dampers. So that's the mindset behind it. But as always, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff, and I'll catch you at my dad's garage. So I've made it to my dad's garage. I just wanted to quickly go over some of the reasons as to why I chose to go for the Bilsteins and the Eibachs. Basically, I really like the quality of the ride on the 9N. It's really good. And according to a lot of forums, people have been saying that the B4s actually give a very similar ride quality and are somewhat better quality overall as dampers. So that was a key pull factor for me. On top of that, I've heard that the Pro Sport springs actually work really well with the B4s. But again, this is all just stuff that I've heard on forums. So once I've actually got them on the car and I've let them bed in, I've driven them for a few weeks, I'll do a little review as to how good they are as a pairing and how they make the car feel a bit different. Obviously, the main reasons behind going for this, as with any time that you would be lowering your car, would be obviously one for the looks and two for the handling. For me, it's the other way around in terms of importance. I'm really looking forward to having a car that handles better than this. That lower center of gravity should be really nice, and the stiffer spring should be a big bonus. Add on top of that a 30mm drop or a 3cm drop, and you've got a car that should look slightly better. It's not going to look slammed, as I mentioned. It's not going to look super lowered, but as a load of you guys mentioned in my last video on the alloys, lowering the car was an absolute must. So let's wait for my dad to get back, and as soon as he is back, let's drop this car by 30mm. Okay, so to run you through this job very briefly, I'll start with the rear shocks and then I'll move on to the front shocks. So the way that you do this is you lift the car off the floor first and foremost using a jack, and then you remove the wheels. If you don't know how to remove wheels, then watch my previous video on how to replace your alloys on your car. So then once you've got the wheel off, you should see just behind the drum brake the spring and the damper, which are separate as opposed to the spring coiling around the damper as you might expect in a normal car. There's a few bolts that you'll need to remove. There's some at the top and then there's some at the bottom in order to get that damper off, and then the spring should be quite easy to get off, but I'll show you that as we go. So here you can see my dad removing the bolts from the bottom of the damper. It was very rusty, which made it quite difficult to actually get the bolts off, so it might be the same in your case. If that is the case, then you can always blast it or whatever to try and get the bolts out. So as soon as you've disconnected the bottom area, it should be quite self-explanatory to get rid of the springs. We've got them off from both sides here because we had both sides jacked up at once, and then it's about taking the two bolts off from the top of the damper and removing the damper from its place. You then need to unscrew the top of your old damper so you can remove the cover, and then put both of these parts back onto your new damper, at which point it's now ready to go onto the car. To do that, you simply put the spring back in place and then tighten up the bolts at the top for the damper, and then obviously do the same for the bottom. It's simply the same way that you took it off. You do the same process backwards. Once everything's on and secure, you can then put the wheel back on. One thing I wanted to mention that I didn't mention in my last video, and some of you rightly pointed out, never over tighten your bolts into your alloy, as it can cause them to over time become more loose. This is something that wouldn't be ideal because your wheel could fall off, and no one wants that to happen. So already you can see the size difference in the springs. So if I take these rear springs here, they actually don't fit into the box unless I really force them, and then it kind of breaks the box basically. So yeah, already you can kind of see that the car's going to be somewhat lower with the new springs on that, which is quite nice to see. I'm really excited for this. I am so excited for this to actually be finished. I'm absolutely gassed, and I really hope it does something for the handling of the car. So once you've repeated that process for the other side of the rear, you want to move on to the front of the car. Obviously the same process applies in terms of removing the alloy wheel, but from this point it does get slightly harder. As you can see, there's a lot more going on with the front suspension than there was with the rear suspension. There's more bolts to remove, and just generally it's a slightly more difficult process, but there's also less rust, so the bolts on this occasion came off quite a lot easier. To make your life easier to actually access this area, you're going to want to turn your wheel outwards. That just gives you plenty more space to work with. Then it's a case of removing the 2 bolts underneath. I'll also show you briefly the bolts on the top that you'll need to remove as well. So here you can see the bottom bolt, that's the top bolt there, which actually holds onto this that links to the roll bar, and then on the top you've got 3 bolts surrounding where the suspension actually fits in. But before you take off those top 3 bolts, you want to get the damper removed from the front axle. So there are more bolts you could actually remove to make this slightly easier, but in our case we decided to use a hammer and a flathead. In this case it just makes life a little bit easier, and a little bit of twisting back and forth of the front end, and you can actually get the damper out nice and easy, as you can see here. Following that, you want to remove those top 3 bolts as I mentioned, and then once those are off you want to remove the whole damper entirely. As you can see, it's a lot more you expect a piece of suspension to look like in terms of having the damper and the coil surrounding it. You then use this handy tool right here to hold the spring in place as you remove the top section that you'll need to put onto your new spring and damper. This isn't actually necessary with the Polo 9N. You don't really need to hold the spring back, as it's not that tense in the first place, but in some cars and particularly vans etc, if you don't have that tool holding it in place, or a tool like it to keep it tense, then it could cause some significant issues, because a spring acts kind of like a gun. Even though the Polo 9N spring isn't very tense, it still kind of explodes when you don't use that tool. You'll then need to get your new spring onto your new damper, which is pretty simple, and then put your old cover and top of the suspension onto that whole section. As you've got lowering springs on, it should be slightly easier. You might not need to actually use a tensioner again to put the bolt in place, but obviously if it is difficult, just use a tensioner and get that bit sorted. Once it's all in place, you want to stick it back through the bottom of the car so that it comes back out the top and lines up with the 3 bolt holes, and then you want to tighten those up. You can just finger tighten them to start with, and then make sure you tighten them up properly later on. You don't want to forget about that. Then you need to put the damper back into the axle, put all of the bolts back into place, and then put the wheels back on. Obviously again, you need to do this for both sides before you can finally lower the car down, take it off the handbrake once and back on, just to make sure that it's got its natural height at this point, and you're pretty much done. The car is going to take a little bit of driving to sag down into its proper position, so the next bit of footage that you'll see will be the car in a week's time at its proper riding height, with me being either very happy or very sad. So it's 2 weeks later, and after some procrastination I have finally recorded the car sagged down to its proper height. I think it's done really well. So if you look at it here, you can see that it's, compared to before, it's not a massive difference, but I think it's just right, as in it looks like the wheels are exactly right in the wheel arches, so I'm really happy with that. Yeah, I think it looks so good, and I've been driving around obviously for 2 weeks and the handling is so much better. I'm really happy with it. I'm hoping obviously that in the near future I'll make an actual video explaining how the handling has been changed and the pros and cons and that kind of stuff, and there haven't really been very many cons, just as a spoiler. But yeah, I mean, really happy with that. If you're doing it, then let me know how your one goes. Topic of the week this week is, have you lowered your car, and if so, how much by? So I've lowered mine by 30 millimeters. How much have you lowered yours yours by, or how much would you lower yours by if you were planning on lowering it in the near future. As always, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff, and thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.